Detroit, winter 1995. The cold enveloped the city, making everything seem frozen. Old cars passed by, leaving a thin trail of smoke, blending into the gloomy atmosphere of a day at the end of the year. The streets were covered in white snow on the sidewalks. Groups of people wrapped in thick coats, hurriedly walking to avoid the cold that seemed to seep into every pore. In the middle of the bustling crowd, a young man was walking silently. Marshall Mathers, also known as Eminem to his friends, did not stand out from the crowd. His grey coat was faded because it was too old. The wool hat was pulled down to cover his thin face. However, his eyes were still bright, carrying a burning fire. The dream of one day escaping poverty and conquering the world with his music. Marshall had no reason to wander the streets in this cold, except that he had just returned from a failed rap contest. The taunts still echoed in his head. What can a white guy do in rap? He clenched his hands in his jacket pockets, trying to contain his anger and frustration. As he reached a corner, he stopped. Next to a trash can, a small girl was huddled. Her thin shirt seemed to be no protection against the harsh cold. In front of her was an old sign, written in black marker. "Please help. All I need is a meal and a place to sleep." Better. Marshall stood still, staring at her. Her eyes were so hard he couldn't look away. They were tired and anxious, but still had a glimmer of hope. He saw himself in them. Someone trying to hold on to anything, to keep from falling apart in this life. He walked closer, sitting down in front of her. "Hello? What's your name?" Marshall asked, his voice softer than ever. The little girl looked up, her eyes frightened, but she still replied, My name is Emma." "Better." "Emma, what are you doing here? Where are your parents?" "Better." Emma bowed her head, clasping her small hands that were red from the cold. "My parents went to look for work. They told me to wait here. But it's been so long." Marshall sighed. He looked around. The scenery of the neighborhood was like a dreary picture. The buildings were ruined, and the streets were covered in mud and snow. This was no place for a child. He felt his heart tighten when he saw Emma's pale lips and trembling little hands. "Have you eaten?" he asked again. Emma shook her head. "I don't have any money, but I don't dare ask any. They look at me like I'm something bad." Marshall bit his lip. He understood that feeling. In this world, the poor are often forgotten or looked down upon, as if they don't deserve to exist. Without hesitation, he took off his coat and draped it over Emma's shoulders. "Put it on. You need it more than I do." Emma was surprised, her eyes filled with worry. "But I'm cold too." Marshall smiled. "Don't worry about me. I can handle it." But the truth was that he was shivering too. Without a coat, the cold seemed to seep into every fiber of his being. However, seeing Emma shrink into her warm coat, he felt his heart lighten. "Wait here a moment. I'll be right back." "Better." Marshall stood up and ran quickly to a nearby grocery store. He rummaged through his pockets. Only a few coins left, all he had. He bought a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, then hurried back. "Here, eat. You need to save your strength." He handed the food to Emma. She took it, her hands shaking. Her eyes were watery as she held the warm bread. "Thank you, but why are you helping me? I'm just a homeless person." "Better." Marshall looked at Emma, a feeling of pity rising in his heart. He put his hand on her shoulder, his voice firm. "You're not homeless. You're a valuable person, and you deserve help. I'm helping you because I know what it feels like. I was like you once, and I want you to know that there are people in this world who care." "Better." Emma said nothing, only nodded. "But you have to promise me one thing," Marshall continued. "No matter how hard life gets, you can't give up. You have to be strong. You have to believe that you can change your destiny." Do you understand? Better. Emma looked up, her eyes sparkling. I promise. Better. Marshall smiled softly. He didn't know what else he could do for her, but he hoped that his words would be a small ray of light in her life. Before leaving, he turned to look at Emma one last time. Emma, stay warm and take care of yourself. I believe in you. Emma nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. Marshall turned away, continuing to walk in the cold winter. But this time, his steps were lighter. He no longer felt like a failure. Meeting Emma reminded him that, even when he had nothing, kindness was still something he could give. That story was deeply engraved in both of their memories. Marshall couldn't have imagined that the small action that day would not only change Emma's life, but also be the motivation to help him continue his thorny musical path. Emma, even as a little girl, never forgot the young man with the faded coat and the determined gaze who came to her in the middle of a cold winter day. 2 decades passed. In the winter of 20, Detroit had changed a lot. The dilapidated buildings of the past had been replaced by modern shopping malls. The streets were cleared of white snow, and the yellow streetlights lit up the sky. But no matter how much things had changed, in Eminem's eyes, this was still home. The memories of his difficult youth, the days of struggling with his dreams, and the small but profound moments like meeting little Emma were still clear in his mind. Marshall Mathers, now one of the most famous rappers in the world, stepped out of a black SUV. He wore a simple wool hat and a thick black parka and looked thoughtful. He had just finished a long tour and decided to take some time back to Detroit, not to organize events or meet the press, but just to walk around, to find something of himself in a life that had changed so much. The strange thing is that even though he has reached the pinnacle of fame, Eminem has never felt completely comfortable. He is not arrogant, nor does he forget his past. On the contrary, he always remembers the difficult days that have shaped him into the person he is today. He walked slowly down the familiar street, now much cleaner and brighter. It was still winter, but this time he did not feel the biting cold like that year. Maybe it was because he had everything to keep warm, or maybe it was because his heart was no longer lonely. Suddenly, his eyes stopped at a small coffee shop on the corner of the street. In front of the shop was a delicately carved wooden sign. Emma's Corner, a place for hope. Marshall stopped. The name of the shop reminded him of the little girl from years ago. A familiar feeling rushed over him, and he decided to step in. Inside the coffee shop, the atmosphere was warm and pleasant. The lovely wooden tables were neatly arranged, and the warm yellow lights made this place like a small home in the middle of the cold winter. The staff in the shop all smiled and welcomed the guests with friendliness. Marshall walked in. No one recognized him as Eminem, partly because of the woolen hat that covered most of his face, partly because of his quiet demeanor. He chose a table in a hidden corner, ordered a cup of hot coffee. While sitting and enjoying it, he suddenly noticed a woman standing behind the bar. She was no longer the little girl shivering in the cold, but her eyes were unmistakable. It was Emma. Emma was now an adult, slim but strong. Her hair was tied up high, her hands quickly making cups of coffee. Her face was radiant, exuding a confidence and peace that she had never had before. Marshall sat silently. An indescribable feeling rose in his heart. He didn't think he would see Emma again, and even less, that the little girl from that day had now built a stable life for herself. He smiled, feeling his heart warm. When Emma stepped out from behind the counter to bring coffee to the customers, her eyes accidentally glanced at Marshall. At first, she didn't recognize him, but then her eyes suddenly widened, as if an old memory had just come flooding back. She stopped, staring at the man in front of her. And when she realized that it was the man who had helped her 20 years ago, she could hardly believe her eyes. "Marshall?" Emma exclaimed, her voice trembling. Marshall looked up, his eyes shining with a gentle smile. "Hello, Emma." Emma put down the coffee tray, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Is it really you? I can't believe it. Do you still remember me?" Marshall nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. "How could I forget? You were a part of my journey. I just didn't expect that. You've grown up and done so many wonderful things." Emma sat down across from him, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You don't know. That day, you saved me. It wasn't just the coat or the bread, but your words helped me not give up. I always remember you. Always tell myself to live better so as not to let down the person who believed in me." Marshall felt his throat tighten. He didn't think that a small action of his that year could change a person's life. "You did great, Emma. I'm proud of you," Marshall said, his voice warm. Emma smiled through her tears, looking around her cafe. "I opened this place to help people like me, people who needed a place to stay, who needed a meal. I wanted this place to be a place where people felt safe and loved." "Better?" Marshall nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. He said nothing more, and just looked at Emma silently. In that moment, they both felt a deep connection without any words. After a while of chatting, Emma smiled and asked, "Do you know that I always wanted to see you again one day, to say thank you?" "Better?" Marshall shook his head, smiling. "You don't need to thank me. I was the one who changed my life. You were just a passerby, leaving a message. Everything I did after that was my own effort." Emma was surprised, then laughed, feeling lighter than ever. When Marshall left the coffee shop, he stood for a moment on the sidewalk. Snow was still falling lightly, the thin snowflakes quietly landing on his black coat. The city of Detroit, in the winter night, was much more peaceful than the memories of the past. He turned his head to look back at Emma's corner, the warm yellow light still shining through the glass window, and inside was Emma's figure, busy with work, but always smiling. Marshall smiled slightly, seeing Emma again, seeing the little girl from years ago now, strong and inspiring so many others, was an indescribable feeling. He suddenly realized that sometimes what he did, no matter how small, could be the spark that ignited hope in the lives of others. On the way back, Emma's words echoed in his mind. "You not only helped me get through a difficult day, but also helped me see my worth." Those words were like a wake-up call, making him appreciate the meaning of kind acts even more. In the coffee shop, Emma stood in front of the window, watching Marshall's figure disappear. A cold wind blew by, but her heart felt strangely warm. Memories of the first time she met Marshall flooded back. That time, she not only received help, but also faith. Faith that even when the world turned its back on her, there were still people who believed in her worth. Emma quietly picked up the piece of paper that Marshall left on the table, rereading the simple but profound handwritten lines. "Thank you for showing me that kindness is never in vain. I'm proud of you." Those lines were like an affirmation of the journey she had gone through. From a homeless girl who didn't dare to look straight into the future, she could now be proud of what she had done. But more than that, she felt that her life now belonged not only to her, but also to those who needed help, just like she had needed it before. Emma turned to look around the cafe. The customers were still sitting there, laughing and enjoying the cozy atmosphere. A small corner of the cafe was reserved for a group of children, reading books from the free bookshelf she had placed there. The bright eyes and laughter of the children were her greatest source of motivation. She picked up the paper, looked at it again, then gently put it away in a small box in the corner of the room. where she kept the most important memories of her life. Marshall was a part of that story, a symbol of the belief that kindness, no matter how small, could change a person's life. Marshall arrived home, sat down on a chair by the window, and looked outside. He took out a small notebook and began to write. Emma's words made him realize that sometimes the songs he wrote, the messages he sent in each song, could also be a way for him to help other lost souls, just like he helped Emma years ago. He wrote, "We don't have to do big things to make a difference. Sometimes, just a sincere word, a small act of kindness, can change a person's life. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who has been helped, and I want to spread that. Never think that your kindness is meaningless. It always counts, even when you don't realize it." Marshall paused, smiled to himself. He closed the notebook, feeling lighter than ever. The meeting with Emma was not just a coincidence, but also a reminder that no matter how much success he had achieved, he could still do something meaningful for others. In the weeks that followed, the story of Eminem and Emma's encounter began to spread, not because Marshall told the press, but because Emma's acquaintances in the community heard about it and shared it. One day, Emma received a letter from a girl living in difficult circumstances. In the letter, the girl wrote, "Emma, I heard about you and Eminem. I always thought I had no hope, but now I know that if I just try, things will change. Thank you for sharing your story. I will not give up." Reading the letter, Emma burst into tears. She knew that her journey was not over. Through what she did, she could inspire and help many more people. Marshall, in an interview, was asked what he was most proud of in his career. He paused for a moment, then answered, "The thing I am most proud of is not the awards or the number of records sold. It's knowing that my music, or sometimes just a small act, can bring hope to others. I believe that any of us can do that." His words not only touched the interviewer, but also touched millions of viewers. Marshall and Emma's story becomes a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, can bring about great change. Not everyone can change the whole world, but everyone can change the world of one person. And when we do that, we are also making the world a better place. In life, every act, every word of kindness is valuable. As long as we believe and continue to spread it, we can light up hope for those who need it most. And just like the winter snow eventually melts to make way for spring, our kindness will always leave a mark, regardless of time.